Uh, Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Samuli Schielke. I will just look for my talk that happens to be closing. All right. So we're happy tonight to host Dr. Samuli Schielke, who will present his book, Migrant Dreams. Samuli, you will have 30 minutes to present your research, and then we will have a few time for the questions from the audience. So everyone, feel free to ask your questions afterwards. Dr. Samuli Schielke is a social and cultural anthropologist writing about contemporary Egypt and the Gulf region. He's a senior research fellow at the Leibniz Centrum Moderne Orient, the ZMO, and author of many books, actually. The Paris of Joy, Egypt in the Future Tense, Migrant Dreams, and Shared Margins. In his recent book, Migrant Dreams, Dr. Samuli takes up the intimate connection between economic, moral, and imaginative aspects of the migrant experience. He follows the trajectories of Egyptian men who migrated to Qatar as contract workers and returned to Egypt to build a married life, but soon had to begin looking for a next opportunity abroad to provide for their families. Migration for work abroad, the book argues, is driven by different kinds of dreams, which is the main point of this book and what I prefer the best, actually. Some of which are conventional and compelling to the degree of being inevitable to pursue, while some are unlikely and unexpected, exceeding the scope of social reproduction. Relations of production are thus also relations of imagination, once reproducing the other, and yet often in an altered shape, causing social transformations that cannot be understood in terms of either tradition or progress. So in this presentation, Samuli Schielke will also connect those themes with his new research on the dream of stability between long-term precarious lives in migrancy and the striving to live in the moral and material comfort of a family home. Dr. Samuli, the floor is yours, and if you want to share some visuals, feel free. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Marion, and thank you very much for organizing this, because we really organized this on a rather short notice, like I think a month ago, and I would have loved to be in person in Kuwait, but right now the COVID pandemic once again makes traveling a somewhat complicated operation. So in the end, we decided that better than canceling the talk is to simply have it online. So I'm glad to see that many people are here. And I'm here today to talk about a book I wrote and a little bit about a sequel to the book that I hope to write. The book is called Migrant Dreams, and I will share the screen now if it works. It works. So Migrant Dreams came out a year and a half ago in English. Actually, the book has been out a little longer because the Arabic translation, interestingly enough, came out already 3 years before the English version. So on the left, you see the Arabic title, which is called حتى ينتهي النفط الهجرة والأحلام في ضواحي الخليج, until the end of oil, migration and dreams in the suburbs of the Gulf. And then the AUC Press that published the English edition preferred the title Migrant Dreams because it's more spot on the topic. I also always like to show these two images because both covers very successfully convey something that I felt and tried to describe during this in this book, that is based on very short field work in Qatar and very long field work in Egypt. It's a book that is in a way much more about Egypt than it's about the Gulf states. It's about what the experience of working as temporary contract worker in a Gulf state, in this case actually Qatar, does to the anticipations, hopeful dreams of a better future that in this book young men pursue. In the left, you see a half-built private house on the outskirts of a village of the kind that were spreading and mushrooming between 2011 and 2017 in Egypt. most of them built with money people had earned abroad, and on the back of it looms the skyline of Dubai as the kind of the horizon of expectation, of ambition that structures much more mundane red brick and concrete construction projects at home. The publisher of the English edition chose a different image for cover, which shows an opposite connectedness. What you see on the cover of the English edition are, as you see, men sitting in front of laptops and with phones on their hands on the ceiling, on the roof of a building. This was at a time. Today, if you go to any workers' accommodation in the Gulf, internet is considered to be a standard necessity, just like air conditioning and water. Back in 2009, accommodations didn't have internet, and these men would go to the ceiling to the roof of their accommodation to tap into an open wireless of some neighbor who had been foolish enough to not put a password on the wireless, and they would use this one wireless connection to call home. So they were all gathered on the roof of a suburban neighborhood, but actually all their attention was on those screens, which were connected with their families, their friends, their wives, or their prospective future brides. And this kind of condition of interconnectedness is this thing that I've always been most interested in studying human migration. I'm an anthropologist by training and career, but I did not train as an anthropologist of migration. It is rather that I was interested in issues of hope and personal careers and trajectories, which in Egypt ended up including a lot of migration. So the story actually begins with a documentary film my late wife Daniela Swarovski and I did in 2007, 2008, 2009, called Messages from Paradise #1. I will share with you in the chat, if I can open it, there a link, because this film, it's actually 2 films, are now meanwhile freely available online. You just need to copy paste the internet address and you get to the site where those films can be seen. Messages from Paradise began with her arrival to visit me in Cairo while I was in fieldwork for something that was not supposed to be about migration, but more about religiosity and morals. And she had these encounters noticing the immense pressure of emigration that young people that she met felt. And at the same time, having met many migrants in Europe, where she worked as a curator for community art projects, who were telling an opposite story, that it was a bad idea to leave their country, that they wanted to go back. And she had the idea of creating a dialogue to confront these different kinds of myths and dreams of migration. And this is how my own story with trying to understand what actually drives people to move to other countries, what drives them to stay, even if they find the situation not satisfactory, even if and also how the imagination, how the fantastic, how dreams of what is possible contribute to that, what actually is built in concrete terms. So this is a way of studying migration that is not so much about the economics of remittances and counting currency rates. It is very much about the economy, but the idea is that the economy is always inherently mixed with moral aims, such as family, building a certain kind of patriarchal family. It's built on fantasies and imaginations of what life could be, what one could want money for, and what else than money one might gain abroad. Since it's a very short book, but the story of the book is actually longer than the book itself. You can read it probably if your Arabic or English is fluent. If you're a fluent reader, you can read it in 2 days. If you're a slower reader, a couple of days more. It's definitely not a long read. And I hope that it's not written in a heavy language. It's worth telling the story because it's also part of how it began. It's a bit of an unusual book for an academic book. Academic books tend to be long. They tend to have a lot of emphasis in proving the kind of author's credentials to speak about the topic. We write long introductions in which we essentially prove that we are competent to write about this topic. And I wrote this book in a different way. First of all, it was my third book, so it was not a book that I would need to qualify for anything. I already had my PhD degree, already had my postdoc degree, and now I could write a book because I wanted to write a book, and I wanted to. And I started writing actually an article, because originally this was just a sort of little side story to the story of my previous book called Egypt in the Future Tense. And I said, okay, this trip of my friends to Qatar and the years they spent there, my visit there, needs to kind of be talked about at a bit more length. I started writing, and instead of having a kind of logic of having a research question and then looking for the answers and understanding what my data is and so on, I took clue from something that Daniela said to me that at first offended me. She had read some of passages from my research diary. I said, oh, why don't you publish your diaries? They are so much better than your boring articles. And after I got over the offense about her finding my articles boring, I realized that in fact the field notes were much more lively, much more narrative, gave much more lively impression of actually what life was like. And I said, okay, I will write that way. And I started collecting all my field notes and then distilling them into the stories that seem to be emerging in them. In that process, it turned out impossible to make an article out of that. It grew and grew, and finally it grew into a book. And as it happened, I had funding to pay for a translation into Arabic, and the Arabic translation of that I very much like to work with, Amr Khairi, was available, so he translated the book as soon as I had written it. So basically, he didn't get a finalized book to write. He translate. He got a draft of a book draft, an unfinished manuscript to translate. He translated it, sent it back to me. I realized that it had many problems. I revised the Arabic version. I'm not good enough in Arabic to actually write in Arabic, but I can revise Arabic. And Tawfiq, who is the main character of the book, whose journey from Egypt to Qatar and then back to Qatar, marriage, and his next migration to Abu Dhabi, the book tells about. Tawfiq also read the Arabic translation and gave me some useful feedback, not only cut this or cut this is not correct, but also he and I discussed about the introductory chapter. The book used to have a very heavy theoretical introductory chapter, which it now doesn't have because it's at the very end. I read it and I realized that all of this, the theoretical chapter was actually not necessary to read the book. It was only useful for those who are interested into it, which is why I put it into the end. And in Arabic edition, it is actually called an appendix, mulhaq, nazari. In the English version, it's now called final chapter. That this creates a book that sets immediately with the narrative. It starts directly with the fieldwork, and it develops a more abstract argument only in the course of time from one very short chapter to another. And it also changed in the process of the English publication. So if you read the two versions, you notice that they're different. The English version is a bit longer. It is actually 2.5 chapters longer than the Arabic edition, because I went around touring with the book in Egypt, giving book talks, talking with the readers, and based on reader feedback, I had to add actually one chapter about class society, another chapter, half a chapter about religion, and a whole chapter trying to think about the Egyptian Gulf migratory experience in global comparison, where I took a rather unlikely case of comparison of my own home country, Finland, which used to be a migrant sending society where hundreds of thousands of people left to Sweden in the 1960s until now we become a migrant receiving society. So this is the kind of story of how this book became what it is. And I tried to make it a fairly narrative book so that you don't actually have to be an anthropologist specialized in migration to appreciate it. And anyway, but more important than the process, of course, is what the book has to say. And I invite you to read it. It starts in Doha, and after Doha, it returns to Egypt, and the book continues in Egypt with Tawfiq's, the main protagonist's marriage, and questions what to do next in a situation when he realized that the one thing he's good at is actually being a migrant worker, and that Egypt doesn't offer him very many possibilities for forward movement. But without going through the whole content or the different chapters of the book, I can try to highlight what I think perhaps is the key argument, the point that the book tries to make, other than telling what it's like. And I think like telling what it's like is the most important thing that the book does. I met people in Qatar who were quite unsatisfied with the job they had. They were quite unsatisfied with the company they were working, and they felt that they were being treated in an unfair way. So they really wanted to tell about the situation, to describe what their life is like. And I think so in one way, the book is an attempt to tell what it's like to be a worker in a very specific historical situation in Qatar in 2009, because meanwhile laws has changed, the political economy of some countries have changed, some things are the same, it's different from one country to the other. So in a way to say it's about migrant workers in the Gulf is an exaggeration, because this is not what the book tells as a sort of overview. It tells about very specific experience. But the publisher told that this would be better to sell the book. And I discovered that surprisingly many Egyptians who had been in other countries, who had been in much higher positions, in much more middle-class jobs, still recognize many of the moments of the experience, even if they would not have worked on 2 years contracts as security guards. Anyway, so one of the things that the book tries to tell is simply what it was like in this particular situation, this class, this historical moment, to be a migrant worker. The other questions it asks are of somewhat more abstract nature, and it has to do about the question of actually what drives this, what motivates people to migrate, since it's not simply about the cost of living and expenses, it's also about what the money is needed there for anyway, about who is entitled and who is expected to live. It has a lot to do with masculinity. It has a lot to do with male breadwinner roles, at least among this group of people who were all single men, leaving either to get married, manage to get married, or to support their families back at home. But it's also a story of often much more fantastic ideas that people had before leaving, of experiencing the world, of having great living in places of consumer luxury, of migrating to the West where they imagine to find freedom. And because of that background, I was very interested in the issue of dreams, or what in Arabic, just like in English, a dream can be both what we see at night when we sleep, but it is also what we strive for, something that is not real, but asks to be realized. This is what I mean with a dream, and I think what also colloquial speech means with a dream, something that is not yet real, but what asks to be realized. And thinking about dreams as something that drives migration, but that migration also produces, I try to think about economic aspects of the process, which are obvious. If it weren't for the potential economic gain, only a handful of misfits and adventurers would leave their home countries. But the economic gain combines with ideas and imaginations of what that gain is there for. And this is what is the basis for the idea of the one-liner that I make at the very end of the book, that economy is not rational and fantasy is not free. So we often sort of implicitly assume that imagination is a space of freedom where we can imagine and wish for or anticipate things that we cannot actually do in the reality. This is true to the degree that indeed I can imagine things that I cannot do. I can imagine I can fly, I can imagine to be rich, I could imagine to be a different person. But at the same time, those kind of imaginations are not unlimited. It's actually quite difficult to think of something that nobody has yet thought before. And this is what we also see in the whole development of human cultures, where human cultures at their most add something or create a new mixture or a new combination of something that was already there before. Ideas, fantasies, hopes are not freely available, and there is also a class hierarchy about who can have what kind of ideals. Poor people can feasibly dream of moving to a city or to another country where they can make more money, but they often would not imagine how to gain the kind of skills that would actually help them to move from low paying to high paying jobs. The understanding, the knowledge, the experience that allows you to imagine specific steps that would lead you forward from there would already require a degree of experience of further knowledge that you need. Imagining a globe-trotting lifestyle of traveling for leisure, discovering places, again requires a certain kind of understanding of safety, of money, of trust in one's future income, so that one would actually spend such money instead of saving it and building a house with it. In that sense, fantasy is not free. We cannot dream at will. And on the other hand, economy is not rational in the sense that it is not simply about, and the smart economists know this perfectly well, it is not simply about realizing given aims, it's actually about what kind of aims we want to realize. Money is not there for itself. If we look at what moves people, is not simply money that moves them, it's actually specific moral aims, ideals of what they want to realize with that money. And in the case of Egypt, and I think this is a widespread case for other places as well. Oops, sorry, that's my camera, but it will be back online in a moment. I will keep talking. I hope you can hear me.
No issues, yes.
Yes, okay. I wonder when the camera will be back online, but I will, I need to turn, I think I simply need to turn it on again, right? Yes, this helps. So, yeah. And therefore, to understand these kind of projects, and then one of the most powerful dreams in Egypt is a very simple one, a very taken for granted one. And I'm especially interested in taken for granted dreams that are not fantastic in the sense that the idea would be strange, but they are difficult in the sense that the idea is obvious, but its realization is hard work, such as getting married in a traditional patriarchal a local marriage where a man accumulates the wealth to build a house or a floor in an apartment, or to buy an apartment in which then his wife will move in, and in which he will be the sole breadwinner with the moral authority over the family, but also with the economic responsibility. To fulfill this role is very much taken for granted. To not act according to this role, but to act according to any other roles is an act of social difference. It requires explanation, it requires defending, it puts one into a complicated position. But actually to pursue this very taken for granted and powerful conservative ideal is a huge amount of work, and lots of people manage barely, and quite a few people succeed in a complicated fashion. And this is often what happens to people who use migration as a path to social becoming, is that they manage to realize a conservative dream of good life, but it actually looks different than what the dream was. And it looks different from what the lives of their parents and grandparents were. I get there in a moment. An image I wanted to share with you. Wait, there. An image I wanted to share with you is from a drawing that Tawfiq, whose journey I follow in this book, drew to me when he was back in Egypt and had gotten married.
Oh yeah, it's sharing now.
Okay. No, okay, but it's sharing the wrong picture, sorry. This is the problem of the slideshow, which keeps jumping. So now it should stay. Yes.
I guess it will come in a second.
Yes, there it is. Yes.
Okay.
We couldn't see the presentation because it wasn't there yet. Now there it is. So when we were talking about what is possible and what is feasible to dream of, and also the idea of life being set of walls. Tawfiq, whose journey the book follows, often spoke about walls. Before his first migration, he described Egypt as a prison When I met him in Doha, in Qatar, he said that it turned out to be a bigger prison where he jumped over one wall and then only found himself next to another wall, and which he had to jump again. And life turned out to be one jump from over the wall to another. When he was back from his second migration to Abu Dhabi, and he had just gotten married, and I sat at the sofa of his living room, I asked him again about this idea, and this time he drew a different picture. And this is actually a picture he drew where he told that he lived in an area where there were plantations, and there were walls along these plantations. The plantations are here. Inside the plantation, they also kept animals and grew plants. And he said, you see, when you walk on the streets, the walls are there not so that the animals don't get out. The walls are there so that you don't get in. And in this case, the idea of limitations, of hindrances, of walls is not one of simply of preventing one from acting, but they're actually productive. Because not only do they hinder you from going left and right in Tawfiq's depiction, they also quite forcefully push you to strive forward to this direction. And this, I think, is a good visual metaphor for what I mean with people dreaming of the inevitable. It's not inevitable that they reach it, but it is, in a certain social context, almost inevitable to strive for it, to at least have to try. And yet, and this is the other part of the argument, this kind of dreams that are powerful because they reinforce their own realization, they reinforce attempts to realize them. Parallel to them are always other weaker dreams that are characterized by being unlikely, difficult to realize, and that's why people also might consider them crazy, irresponsible, unconventional. They might include other parts of social nonconformity, looking for alternatives, which does not mean that they would necessarily be so much more innovative or unconventional. They also include quite conventional dreams like love and marrying the person you love, which is a very widespread dream. However, realizing it is very difficult, and while there is a huge pressure to get married, there is actually no pressure to get married with the person you love. On the contrary, that is actually the difficult thing. It is there is a widespread ideal, but actually the means, the pressure to realize that ideal are much less. Other examples would include engagements with poetry, literary, also political action in 2011 in Egypt during the revolution, thinking of lives that exceed the taken for granted. And this is also, and this is the kind of dialectic that takes place in the migratory process, where on one level it's a very powerful normalization engine that actually puts people into situations of quite a tight spot where you actually have to work very hard under conditions that are often quite exploitative for profits that are smaller than you expect, but they are there. The profits are real, and as long as the profits are real, you have to learn to economize for those dreams which you are supposed to and expected and must pursue. This creates this very strong power of migratory projects also to reproduce conservative, patriarchal, and male breadwinner models. But the trick is that because it produces surplus, this excess, very much following the logic of capitalism, that is a constant process of transformation, because it's a surplus, excess, and reinvestment-based process. Also, migratory experiences create also more than they aim for. Just like some people are disillusioned, they go out with huge fantasies of wealth and freedom of whatever, and come back sort of much more in a sober mood, understanding that a man's going to do what a man's going to do, and here's the house and here's the bride. It also results in people who go out with fairly conventional expectations, sometimes, often not within a year or two, but in the matter of a generation, creating a different, wider set of expectations, such as urban careers, urban lifestyles. One of the interesting cases are people of the most important, actually, people who represent this transformation are children of migrants who are born and grow up abroad. This is a big topic of study, of course, in Europe and North America. In the Gulf, it's a very interesting topic of study because these people are still non-national, so they carry the same precarity of their parents, but with a much more complex belonging. That's not so much my topic of research, but many others. have done really good work on this. Now I'm almost through my 30 minutes, right? So I will just tell about, I will stop there. Tell about a little bit of sequel I hope to write to this book. So after Migrant Dreams was published, I was actually busy with finishing another book, which is about a different aspect of imagination, which is about literary writing, which was published in English in Germany last summer. It's actually freely available online. I'll add you the link later. But what I really wanted to do is actually to continue on the topic of migration and the Egypt Gulf link, because I felt that actually that little book had only scratched on one particular part of the experience. And I was very interested in the building of houses. The idea, this very idea of the migrant return house, in which people so often don't return, which is such a paradoxical project because it's so much the central aim of many people's migratory journeys. The house is the main aim often for people to move somewhere. And yet I was just today on lunch talking with Taufik, the same man who is the main character of the book. And he was struggling with that. He doesn't know what to do. In a year, the new house that he's been saving for years and put an enormous labor of love also into details of its decoration. In a year, the house will be ready and it will be paid, because now he has a comparably well-paid job in Dubai that is quite a bit better than what he used to have. And then what? He will, if he returns to Egypt, he will have only a very badly paid job, and he doesn't know, and it's not one that would allow him to give his children the education that he would like to, but it would allow him to return to his home village, which he loves and where he feels it's best. If he stays abroad, then he will be able to provide for his family and continue his career, but he is not a man who gets used to living abroad. Many men get alienated from their family. Their wives are not happy when they're back. They're not happy to be back. So if he really wants to be with his wife and children, the idea of staying away for many more years is very unsatisfactory. The next alternative is that soon, if his salary continues to rise, he might be able to bring his family over to Dubai and to live with them here. But then he asks, why did I build that house? Since it is not what he has really aimed for in life, but actually to have a happy life in his home village. These kind of questions arise, and they arise, and this became the topic of a book I want to write. Only it turned out to be a very different one, because I had wanted to make an itinerant ethnography traveling between Egypt and all the different places where people from one village I know are working, only for there to come to COVID-19 and all my travel plans failing. But luckily, one place that was accessible and welcoming visitors was Dubai. So I arrived in Dubai and realized that there was actually much more to tell than about migrant return houses, because Dubai and the UAE in particular also have a transforming political economy where humans, real estate, trade are becoming more and more important source gradually over decades of the economy, which also means that there is much more effort and appreciation to keep people living, spending and investing in the country as long as possible, which turns the UAE into an inviting place for people to stay as long as they can. And I knew that this is the case with middle-class families who can afford it. Arriving in Dubai, I encountered people who could not afford it, whose salary would not actually be enough for a family visa, and yet they were also thinking of the same striving. Less and less, surprisingly few people, I mean, most people were still bound for return to Egypt, but I meant surprisingly many people whose dreams were not about return to Egypt, but to move either forward to places where permanent residence was possible, or to move upward in social scale and salary to be able to secure the standard of living that allows long-term residence in the Emirates. And this is a kind of a story that then is turning out to be the kind of surprising sequel to Migrant Dreams, but I will have to write the book. That will take a little while. Thank you very much.